address the question of whether or not modern science makes Christianity and religion in general obsolete or irrelevant. As a matter of fact, it clearly hasn't. We've had modern science around for a while, and there are many people that are still religious, some of them modern scientists. But I think the question here is whether such people are rational in continuing to be persons of faith despite the evidence that we have from modern science. So that's what I want to address. I think the fact that there are still so many who are religious should, however, suggest that the burden of proof is on those who would say that the two are incompatible, or that modern science does in fact make religion obsolete. One way that you might try to make that argument is by looking at specific scientific theories and how they might be incompatible with religious truth claims. To take what I think is probably the most obvious contemporary example, someone might make an argument like the following. We now know that evolution is the proper explanation of human origins, but religious persons must reject evolution. Therefore, religion and science are incompatible. From my perspective, this is a bad argument. Even if you accept premise one, that evolution is the proper explanation of human origins, I see no reason that you should accept premise two, which is that religious people have to reject evolution. I, in fact, know many religious people, Christians included, who accept the theory of evolution and consider themselves they have a theological view of the role of evolution and the work of God in creating the universe. So it seems to me that the burden of proof is on those who want to show that there is an incompatibility, and I see no reason that Christians or other people of faith can't accept the theory of evolution. In fact, I'm not aware of any contemporary scientific theory that is obviously incompatible with the truth claims of Christianity. I think the deeper question is whether the nature of scientific explanation, and particularly the success of modern science, makes Christian faith and other forms of faith irrelevant. I think what motivates this concern is a sort of picture of the way that scientific explanation works, or the way explanation in general works. You might think of the world as a big question mark, something that demands explanation. And you might think that every time we have a scientific explanation of some feature of the world, there's less room for a supernatural explanation or an explanation in terms of divine action. So the picture here, I think, is that the incremental and rapid success of modern science is crowding God out of the picture. Here, I think the helpful thing to do is to interrogate that picture. Is that the right way to understand the relationship between scientific explanations of the world and other kinds of explanations of the world? There's a sort of popular picture that the reason that it used to be, back in the good old days, so easy for people to believe is that they didn't have laws of nature to explain the natural order around them. But that picture is just plainly false. They didn't have modern laws of nature, but they certainly had naturalistic explanations for things that happened. That's why the virgin birth was such a surprise. They knew that births are part of the natural pattern and that they can be explained naturalistically. So that picture, I think, is an example of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. In fact, human beings have long known that there is a natural order and that you can explain many features of that order by appealing to other natural features. Someone that I find helpful on this is Thomas Aquinas, and he has a picture that goes something like this. This is not the only way to make sense of how natural explanations and supernatural explanations are compatible, but it's a helpful one. Aquinas thought that in creating, God created material objects that have a range of powers. And laws of nature simply describe the way that these powers interact. God, however, is the creator of those powers and can at any moment create new things with new powers, override or revoke other powers. So that at one and the same time, miracles are entirely possible, and yet there is a natural order that is explicable in terms of the natural powers of objects. So Aquinas, for instance, would explain the movement of the stars as being primarily caused by God, who creates the stars with their natural powers, and secondarily explained by those natural powers themselves. There you have an example of natural scientific explanation at one with and in harmony with supernatural or divine explanations. The only way that I see a problem emerging in the relationship between religion and science is if either religion oversteps its bounds or misunderstands its task, or, on the other hand, science does the same. We have titles for each of those kinds of overstepping. On the side of the scientist, you might think of the rise of the so-called New Atheist movement. New Atheists will claim that the only kind of knowledge we have is scientific knowledge, and that any other explanation is mere opinion. This, it seems to me, is overstepping the boundaries of science. You can't do a scientific experiment to prove the fact that only scientific explanations give us knowledge. So on the one hand, an insistence on what some have called scientism or philosophical naturalism does indeed create a rift between religion and science. On the other hand, there are some, we sometimes use the label religious fundamentalists, who would read the religious text, for instance the Bible, as a scientific text and conclude that we can make decisions about which scientific theories are true or false on the basis of an interpretation of Scripture. This seems to me to similarly overstep the boundaries and to assume that religion is providing answers to questions that the texts are not themselves meant to ask. So I think as long as we're careful about what science is and what Christianity is, what scientific experiment can establish, and what religious texts are meant to give an account of, there's no reason to think that modern science has made religion obsolete.